The problem of universals is an ancient problem in metaphysics about whether universals exist. There are two main positions in this debate: nominalists, who deny that there are universals, and realists, who maintain that there are universals. Universals are general or abstract qualities, characteristics, properties, kinds, or relations such as being female, blue, an animal, or between, that can be predicted of individuals or particulars, or that individuals or particulars can be regarded as sharing or participating in. For example, John, Mary, Poppy, and Sue all have the quality of being human. Being human, or humanity, is the universal they have in common. While many standard cases of universals are also typically regarded as abstract objects such as humanity, abstract objects are not necessarily universals. For example, one might hold that numbers are particular yet abstract objects. The problem of universals is about their status. Do these universals exist independently of the individuals of whom they can be predicted? Are they merely convenient ways of talking about and finding similarity among particular things that are radically different? If they exist, do they exist in the individuals or only in people's minds, or in some separate physical domain? These questions arise from attempts to account for the phenomenon of similarity or attribute agreement among things. For example, live grass and Granny Smith apples are similar or agree in an attribute, namely in having the attribute of greenness. This issue, however, is how to account for this and related facts. There are two main positions on this issue: realism and nominalism, sometimes called anti-realism about universals. Realism is the realist view about universals, claiming that universals are real, that they exist, and are distinct from particulars that instantiate them. There are various forms of realism. Two forms are Platonic realism and Aristotelian realism. Platonic realism is the view that universals are real entities and they exist independent of particulars. Aristotelian areas of realism, on the other hand, is the view that universals are real entities but their existence is dependent on the particulars they exemplify. Realism has been endorsed by many, including Plato, Aristotle, and Bertrand Russell. Realists tend to agree that universals must be posited as distinct entities in order to account for various phenomena. For example, a common realist argument, arguably found in Plato, is that universals are required for certain general words to have meaning and for the sentences in which they occur to be true or false. Take the sentence, "Jimmy Page is a musician." The realist may claim that the sentence is only meaningful and expresses a truth because there is an individual, Jimmy Page, who possesses a certain quality, musicianship. Thus, we must posit both the individual and the property he has, and the property is a universal that is distinct from the particular individual who has the property. Nominalism, on the other hand, asserts that only individuals or particulars exist and denies that universals are real, meaning that they exist only as entities or beings. The term nominalism comes from the Greek nomen, or name. There are various forms of nominalism, which is sometimes referred to as terminism. The three major forms are resemblance nominalism, conceptualism, and trope nominalism. Nominalism has been endorsed or defended by many, including William Ockham in Occam's Razor, D.C. Williams, David Lewis, arguably H.H. Price, and W.V.O. Quine. Nominalists often argue for their view by claiming that realism has an insurmountable problem. Another sort of argument for their view is that nominalism can account for all relevant phenomena, so, by Occam's razor, or some sort of principle of simplicity, nominalism is a preferable metaphysical theory to realism, since it posits fewer kinds of entities. Plato, at least during the first part of his life, believed that there was a sharp distinction between the world of sensible objects and the world of universals or forms. One can only have mere opinions about the former, but one can have knowledge about the latter. For Plato, it was not possible to have knowledge of anything that could change or was particular, since knowledge had to be forever unfailing in general. For that reason, in the world of forms is the real world, like sunlight. The sensible world is only imperfectly or partially real, like shadows. Plato accordingly took a realist position regarding universals. This Platonic realism, however, in denying full reality to the material world, sharp modern forms of realism which generally assert the reality of the external physical world, and which in some versions deny the reality of ideals. One of the first nominalist critiques of Plato's realism was that of Diogenes of Sinope, who said, "I've seen Plato's cups and table, but not his cupness and tableness." Plato's student Aristotle disagreed with Plato. Aristotle transformed Plato's forms into formal causes, the blueprints or essences of individual things. Whereas Plato idealized geometry, Aristotle emphasized biology and related disciplines, and therefore so much of his thinking concerns living beings and their properties. The nature of universals in Aristotle's philosophy therefore hinges on his views of natural kinds. Consider for an example a particular oak tree. This is a member of the species, and it has much more in common with other oak trees, past, present, and future. It's universal. Its oakness is a part of it. A biologist can study oak trees and learn about oakness, and more generally the intelligible order within the sensible world. Accordingly, Aristotle was more confident than Plato about coming to know the sensible world. He is an early empiricist. Aristotle was a new kind of realist about universals. Some may call this view moderate realism. An early medieval proponent of nominalism was William of Ockham. Ockham argued that only individuals exist, and that universals are only mental ways of referring to sets of individuals. "I maintain," he wrote, "that a universal is not something real that exists in a subject, but that it has a being only as a thought object in the mind." Hence Ockham's nominalism is also referred to as conceptualism. As a general rule, Ockham argued against assuming any entities that were not necessary for explanations. Accordingly, he wrote, "There is no reason to believe that there is an entity called humanity which resides inside Socrates." Nothing further is explained by saying that. This is in accord with the analytical method, which has since come to be called Occam's razor, the principle that explanations of any phenomenon should make as few assumptions as possible. Conceptualism is a position subsequently identified as being formulated by Pierre Abelard. This advertises itself as a middle way between nominalism and realism. There is something in common between like individuals, but it is a concept in the mind, not an objective reality. Critics argue that conceptualist approaches like Abelard's only answer the psychological question of universals. If the same concept is correctly and non-arbitrarily applied to two individuals, there must be some resemblance or shared property between the two individuals that justifies their falling under the same concept, and that is the just metaphysical problem that universals were brought in to address, the starting point of the whole problem. If resemblances between individuals are asserted, conceptualism becomes moderate realism. If they are denied, it collapses into nominalism. In modern thought, George Berkeley, best known for his empiricism, was also an advocate of extreme nominalism. Indeed, he disbelieved even in the possibility of a general thought as a psychological fact. It is impossible to imagine a man, the argument goes, unless one has in mind a very specific picture of one who is either tall or short, European or Asian, blue-eyed or brown-eyed, etc. When one thinks of a triangle, likewise, it is always obtuse, right-angled, or acute. There is no mental image of a triangle in general. Not only then do general terms fail to correspond to extra-mental realities, they don't correspond to thoughts either. Berkeley and nominalism contributed to the same thinkers' critique of the possibility of matter. In the climate of English thought, in the period following Isaac Newton's great contributions to physics, there was much discussion of a distinction between primary qualities and secondary qualities. The primary qualities were supposed to be true of material objects in themselves, whereas the secondary qualities were supposed to be more subjective. But on Berkeley's view, just as it is meaningless to speak of triangularity in general aside from specific figures, so it is meaningless to speak of mass and motions without knowing the color. If the color is in the eye of the beholder, so is the mass. Stuart Mill discussed the problem of universals in the course of a book that eviscerated the philosophy of William Hamilton. Mill wrote, "The formation of a concept does not consist in separating the attributes which are said to compose it from all other attributes of the same object, and enabling us to conceive these attributes disjoined from any others. We neither conceive them, nor think them, nor cognize them in any way as a thing apart, but solely as forming in combination with numerous other attributes the idea of an individual object." At this point in his discussion he seems to be siding with Berkeley, but he proceeds to concede, under some verbal camouflage, that Berkeley's position is impossible, and that every human mind performs the trick Berkeley thought impossible. In other words, we may be temporarily unconscious of whether an image is white, black, or yellow, and concentrate our attention on the fact that it is a man, and on just those attributes necessary to identify it as a man, but not on any particular one, it may then have significance as a universal of manhood.